Okay, so if you remember yesterday, so where we left off was that we basically had two frameworks of how to think of Machatzit HaShekel. On the one hand, you could think of Machatzit HaShekel as fundamentally being a fundraiser for the Mikdash, result-oriented, in which case you would assume that it doesn't translate into tzedakah the way the Ramban, Ritva, Malbim, etc. think. You would think it doesn't apply once the Mikdash is non-existent anymore, etc. On the other hand, you have the Shita to say no, it's focused on the giving itself, either because you want to take a virtue approach or a deontological approach, or for the Ramban a more spiritual approach, that it's you give likapara, so that it is mechaper on you, so it brings atonement for the giver. That opens up the possibility of saying it's not about the Mikdash per se. You just happen to give the money that you gave to anywhere for a kapara to the Mikdash. But that's why for the Ramban, once it's about the giving, it can be translated into the mitzvah of tzedakah later on, because the whole point is that you're supposed to give. That provides kapara for the person, etc. And because of that, obviously, the mitzvah applies even post-Mikdash. Again, the extreme version of that is the Ramban Ritva Malbim, who say that the giving of the Shlishit HaShekel of tzedakah is the giving of the Machatzit HaShekel, which is a very strong way of saying this is not Mikdash related because it's about the giving. Where we left off yesterday was the Rambam, because the Rambam is a little bit weird in that sense, because the Rambam does very much say that the mitzvah is to give, right? It's focused on the giving, on the very act of giving. And that's what he says in the Sefer HaMitzvot, Hu Tzivanu Latet Machatzit HaShekel B'chol Shana V'Shana, in Hilchot Shkalim Aleph Aleph, Mitzvah Latem Torah Litain Kol Ish Miyisrael Machatzit HaShekel B'chol Shana V'Shana. But he does think that it's limited to the time of the Mikdash. And the question is why, right? I mean, if the mitzvah is to support the Mikdash, fine. But the mitzvah is to give, right? So you've got to come up with a slightly more nuanced formulation to explain why it's a mitzvah to give every year, and yet only when there's a mikdash. What exactly is he getting at? So Rav Asher Weiss tries, and that's what I gave you here first, to try to figure out what exactly the nature of the mitzvah is for the Rambam. So he says, "Hinei tzarech be'ur. Lama katava Rambam melchut shkalim v'sefer hazmanim v'lo v'sefer ha'avoda." Right. So to get the full picture of the Rambam, besides for what we already highlighted, which on the one hand he thinks the mitzvah of giving per se, but on the other hand is limited to when the mikdash exists. But he says there's other oddities, because if it was really mikdash oriented 100%. Which is what it sounds like, because the Rambam says it only applies when there's a mikdash. So where would you have expected Hilchot Shkalim? In Sefer HaAvodah, in the book that deals with the Beit HaMikdash. And yet, where does he put it? Or Karbanot, which deals with Karbanot, one or the other. But it's not in Karbanot and not Avodah. Where is it? It's in Zmanim, right? Which very much makes it sound like it's independent, which is what you would have thought, right? Like the Ramban, like the Ritva. He notes that, to be fair, in the Mishnah, the same is true. Shkalim is in Moed and not in Kachim. So he says, okay, let's be very careful with the Rambam. Maybe even the Rambam will not say that the mitzvah is to give to the Karbanot, maybe, as we were medayik, the Rambam really thinks the mitzvah is to give it, like he says in Reish Hilchot Shkalim, as we read it, right? The first halacha in Shkalim is simply mitzvah seminat Torah litain kol ish miyisrael machatzit HaShekel b'chol shana v'shana, and he notes v'rak b'perek dalid. Katav Shumar Alishka Ma'yaseh Balokhin Mimena Kamanat Tibor Dizetin Shumar Alishkava Ein Zeh Hagdarat Mitzvah. So the fact that it goes to the mikdash, the Rambam only highlights in halacha in Perek Dalid, right? In Perek Dalid, V'gam b'Sefer HaMitzvot, and he's in the Sefer HaMitzvot as well. See there, Rambam Mitzvah Zu, but they call Mitzvah HaMoadim. He puts in a mitzvah kufayin aleph, which is in the middle of the mitzvah moadim and not the mikdash. V'od nireh l'dayek kain dinei der kosher Rambam sefer mitzvah l'chtov lo rak ma'aseh mitzvah l'gam inyana u'mehuta. So in the Rambam, Zivar mitzvah doesn't just tell you the act of the mitzvah, but its nature. Like when he writes of note, bayit avodah. Like in the context of Beit HaMikdash, he says, build a Beit HaMikdash for the purpose of performing avodah. Uva mitzvah naseh lamed gimel, levosh begadim le'avodah. When he says wearing the begadim in the Beit HaMikdash for avodah. Aval behilchot shkalim uva mitzvah aseh kufayin aleph, lo katav latet machzah shekel lo karbanot, ela latet machzah shekel b'chol shana v'shana. V'nir'eh mized etzem ha-mitzvah v'yisodah latet machzah shekel b'zman yadua b'chol shana v'shana. U'milta achrita hi sheshkalim elam yuadim l'karbanat tzibur. So based on this, Rav Asher Weiss is medayik, as we were medayik, that the Rambam in this sense is more like the Ramban, right? That the mitzvah is the giving of the machzah shekel, point one, and it happens to be that once you collect it, you give it to the mikdash. Right? The problem is that unlike the Ramban and the Ritva and the Ralbag, he doesn't think the mitzvah applies when the Beit HaMikdash doesn't exist. And that's why I said the Rambam, on the one hand, seems very Rambam-like, right? And yet, he doesn't hold it applies when there's no Beit HaMikdash. So what is the hybrid position? So here's one suggestion. So Rav Asher continues, Uvehilchot shkalim Kasava Rambam. The ain mitzvah zo no heget el bizman habayit. Right, the Rambam holds that it only applies when there's a Beit HaMikdash, which again, to highlight the problem for the 10th time. If you're Rashi, of course it only applies when there's a Beit HaMikdash, because the mitzvah is result-oriented, to raise funds for the Beit HaMikdash, for the Karbanot. For the Ramban, that the mitzvah is about giving, because it provides kapara, so it is a Maisa mitzvah, it's not about the result, it's about the act, and therefore, when there's no Beit HaMikdash, we just translate it into tzedakah. Both of those positions are easy to understand. But if you think it's about the giving, and the Rambam separates what you do with the money by 3 full prakim from the act of giving, so then you still have to explain why does it only apply when there is a Beit HaMikdash. So he says, "V'kiryat sefer sham katav dekach mashma lishna dekra." V'cheinu b'smag mitzvah aseh shenemar v'lakach lekez v'kiburim natata oto avodat oel moed v'zman sh'avodat oel moed no heget v'zman sh'beit HaMikdash kaim nodim et eshkalim. So he says, look at the smag. The smag says, give the money only when there's no oel moed, and then he quotes a pasuk that b'zman sh'oel moed no heget, right? Only when there's no oel moed or Beit HaMikdash. He said, why do you need a drasha? If Rashi were right, that you were raising money only for the Beit HaMikdash, of course it only applies when there's a Beit HaMikdash. So he says, this is what proves his position. Even when there isn't karbanot, you would have a hava amina that it applies anyways. Achba Bartanura, right, that's Rabovadia Bartanura, Reish Ayin Bet. The Bartanura does really seem to say there's no karbanot, there's no machzah shekel. Ach ein midvar stira l'dvarenu. Digam b'chavanato yeshnom decheven dezedin truman alishka. Shekonim imenu karbanot tzibor eno noego b'zman sheyesh karbanot. Yesh lomar. B'chol zil shita Rambam the makrivin aval b'shein bayit the nichol if you said tzarech gzera katuv v'drom machzah shekel. He said maybe according to the Rambam you would say since in theory you could bring karbanot even without a Beit HaMikdash, right? It's even a bigger question, and that's why the Rambam has to chalk it up to gzera katuv. Ach be'emet ze eno nira de av efshar la'akriv k'shein bayit ach ein chiyuv la'asot kein. Said even according to the Rambam that maybe in theory you can bring karbanot without a Beit HaMikdash, there's no chiyuv. So what does he say? He says, look, in the end of the day, what you're going to have, right, according to the Rambam, what you'll have to do is chalk it up to some sort of zirata katuv, meaning the mitzvah is to give, it happens to go to the mikdash, but that's not its definition, right? It's not a fundraiser for the mikdash. It's a mitzvah nitina that has a gzirata katuv that because of, I don't know, it's associated with the mikdash. so it only applies when they're in Mikdash. In Achanami, when there is a Mikdash, the mitzvah is to give, not just because of the result, because of the act, right? But it's the Ziring HaKosher tells you it's conceptually linked it up to the Mikdash, meaning it's not like the Ramban, that it's just about giving, because it provides kapara, right? It's a giving which is associated with the Mikdash. It's not, right, its definition. It defines its parameters, and so you're going to have to come up with sort of this hybrid position, where the mitzvah, yes, is to give every year. It happens to be the money goes to the Mikdash, but that is enough to create an association with the Mikdash from the Ziring HaKosher that it only applies when it's the Mikdash, right? So you have to come up with something like that, right? That it's like, it's not, right? Meaning in the end of the day, the Rambam puts it in Zmanim because it's not only a Mikdash halacha, right? It's, and you know, you have things like this, right? You have halachot where, you know, they're not, you know, their connection to the Mikdash is not as direct, but they still might be enough connected that the halacha is that when there's no Mikdash, they don't apply, right? It's sort of a middle position, right? You know, you could sharpen it more than he does, right? Maybe you could say that, look, the mitzvah, it's not just a result-oriented, but it's not generic giving. It's Mikdash giving, right? How you use the money in the Mikdash is sort of accidental, but still, it's Mikdash-oriented giving or something like that. It's a mitzvah to contribute to Avodah Hashem in that way. I don't know, right? You'd have to come up with some middle formulation. But what Rav Asher highlights, is we've been highlighting, is on the one hand, the Rambam does say it only applies to the Mikdash, but on the other hand, he says the mitzvah is the giving. He separates what you use the funds for by 4 prakim from the fact that there's a mitzvah to give. He puts the halacha in Hilchot Zmanim and amongst the Yamim Tovim and not in the halacha of the Karbanot, which means the Rambam seems to have some sort of middle position, right? That it's not just a fundraiser for the Mikdash, and yet it's still conceptually linked enough to the Mikdash that it only applies when there is a Mikdash, right? And it's a little bit of an uncomfortable of a compromised position, but it seems to be what the Rambam has to say. I'm open to sharper formulations for the Rambam. Yeah, Rami. Right. There's no missing third according to those sheets because the numbers are the same. But the difference between them is that you cultivate something that is gone, like we're not providing regular like that. Not just because that was for general again, I don't know anyone who says that, meaning all the Shitot who think that it's equivalent to Machatzit HaShekel think that it's actually the same numerically. Ramban, Ralbag, Ritva. Right? And then the Shitot who think it's not about tzedakah, right? No one says that 2/6 of the mitzvah is mikdash, right? Sorry, 1/6 is mikdash and 2/6 are giving. I mean, it's a very fancy lumdus, but no one says that, as far as I know. I don't know. Now, Rav Asher, correct, I think very compellingly notes that, right, the Rambam himself may not say this, but it's very easy to see the Ramban, Ritva, Ralbag position as the logical extension of thinking that it's really about the Netinah, as we've talked about several times, and that's why they think it can be translated into tzedakah. He suggests that the reason it translates into tzedakah is because maybe the nature of the mitzvah is to contribute to communal needs, right? Tzarchei tzibor, which might be mikdash, might be tzedakah, something like that. Okay. But what you see is that really, again, the neatest positions conceptually are Rashi or the Ramban, the Ritva, right? Because again, the Ramban, Ritva, Ralbag thinks the mitzvah is the giving because it provides you with kapara, and it applies when there's no mikdash, and it just translates into tzedakah. Rashi seems to think, no, the mitzvah is to raise funds for the Beit HaMikdash, and if that's what it is, it's result-oriented, it makes a lot of sense, that it only applies when there's Beit HaMikdash. But to say that it's a mitzvah that belongs to the world of Moadim, right? You put it in Zmanin, you put it with the Chagim, you say the mitzvah is to give, it's not just what you give it to then turn around and say, but it only applies when there's a mikdash. So either you just say it's Gzeira Katuv, or you say it's like, it has to be somewhat conceptually linked to mikdash, but in a less direct way than Rashi would have it, or something like that, right? It's a sort of an uncomfortable middle position, but I do think that's where the Rambam and the Smag seem to fall. Yes, Ezra, you had a question. Again, I'm open for a better formulation than the Rambam. This is, right, Rav Asher is, based on the Smag, saying it's Gzeira Katuv, because, it really is an uncomfortable middle position. So it's hard to conceptualize. If you have a better one, I'd be thrilled. Yes? Right. So that I think would be an interesting possibility, which would be to say, look, maybe you're right. The actual mitzvah itself is mikdash oriented, right? But the secondary aspect, that there's a benefit to giving every year, is always true, and therefore they created a rabbinic chiyuv to give tzedakah every year, and they modeled it not exactly in Machatzit HaShekel, but they created a similar parallel. Right? The Rambam made himself believe this, though on a Doraisa level, right? That Machatzit HaShekel is a mitzvah to give. Tzedakah also has an element of that, where the mitzvah is to give and not just to help the poor people, but to be a giver. And in fact, the Rambam's language in Hilchot Shkalim and and in the context of tzedakah is very similar in that sense. Right? So you might be right? You might be right that they are similar mitzvah in that sense, or they're mimicking each other, but they're not the same. It's possible. It's definitely possible. Okay. Fine. If you turn to the next piece, and this is how Rav Asher starts his piece, Rav Asher notes that, in addition to the question we've been dealing with, the exact question of what is the nature of the mitzvah is quite complicated. And he highlights 6 different positions as to the nature of the mitzvah. So, 2 of them we've seen inside, the Rambam and the Ramban. So according to him, according to the Rambam, the mitzvah is a Doraisa Derabanan, Machatzit HaShekel, yearly, very clearly. What is it? We've seen the Rambam inside. What is it? Biblical or rabbinic, yearly, or only in the time of the building of the Mishkan. What does the Rambam say? It's not a trick question. Mitzvah aseh. Look back at the Rambam. Mitzvah aseh. U'shiyonu l'tet Machatzit HaShekel b'chol shana. Right? Every year. What's the source? Parshat Kitisa. Right? Parshat Shkalim. Very simple. Right? So the Rambam thinks that it is a biblical mitzvah aseh based on the psukim in Kitisa to give Machatzit HaShekel every year. Yes? Okay. 2, the Ramban. Does the Ramban say it's a mitzvah every year? Mitzvah aseh, based on Parshat Kitisa? Yes. We know that. The Ramban goes farther than the Rambam because he thinks it's true, even when there's no mikdash, because he thinks that this is the basis of the chiyuv to give a shlish of shekel to tzedakah. But the Ramban, unlike the Rambam, adds an element. What does he add? What? Right, he also has a lo taseh, right? Which is that Machatzit HaShekel is also a lo taseh of ha'ashir lo yarbev v'adal lo yamit, right? So you could have looked at that as just the parameters of the original mitzvah, but the Ramban says no, those are 2 separate things. The interesting thing is that when it comes to tzedakah, the Ramban seems to only think one of them is true, that the mitzvah to give continues, right? Right, meaning, because remember I asked you the question, I said, wait a second, according to the Ramban and the Ritva and the Ralbag, we have a problem. Because if you think that Machatzit HaShekel is the source of the Shlishit HaShekel, that's a problem. Because by Machatzit HaShekel, there's a minimum and a maximum. But by tzedakah, there's only a minimum and not a maximum. I mean, there is a maximum, but it's not the same thing. It's not a third of a shekel. It's 10%, 20%, etc. So how do you work that out? But the Ramban will actually have a very elegant answer, which is, there's a mitzvah aseh, to give the Machatzit HaShekel, and there's a mitzvah lo taseh, right, of ha'ashir lo yarbeh v'ada lo yamit. So it could be that for Ramban, the mitzvah of not giving more or less, either that's limited to the time of Moshe, to the original Mishkan, or it's limited to the contributions to the Mikdash, but the mitzvah to give, right, I mean, if you think that the mitzvah to not give more or less is a qualification of the mitzvah of Machatzit HaShekel, and you think that the Shlishit HaShekel Staka is carrying over to Machatzit HaShekel, so then nowadays you should not be allowed to give more than a third of a shekel to Staka, right? That would be Shlishit HaShekel is the minimum of Staka, Machatzit HaShekel is Machatzit HaShekel, correct. According to the Ramban, it's the same amount because of deflation, right? But again, if you thought that the qualification of not giving more or less was a detail in Machatzit HaShekel, point one. And two, you thought the chiyuv to give a minimum of a third of shekel to tzedakah is just the reiteration of the Machatzit HaShekel, you would be limited to giving to tzedakah to more than a third of a shekel, right? But you have an elegant answer for the Ramban, which is there's two mitzvot. There's a mitzvah aseh to give the Machatzit HaShekel, and a separate isser to not give more or less. And it could be that for the Ramban, the mitzvah aseh applies always and is expandable, but the lo taseh is either limited to Moshe Rabbeinu's time or to the Machatzit HaShekel to the Mikdash for whatever reason they'd have to figure out, but not the aseh. Now, Rav Asher does note that whether the Ramban really means this is unclear because he says it al Torah, but in Sefer HaMitzvot he doesn't add it, so how seriously they have to take it is a little bit unclear, but okay. The Tashbei to the Zohar Rakia goes even farther. And he says, not only is there one lo taseh, but there's two. What are they? Ha'ashir lo yarbeh, Isser 1, Vada lo yamit, Isser 2. Meaning the Isser for a rich person to give more, and it is appropriate. It's not two lavim, meaning, according to Ramban, it's a lav to, if we sharpened it, it's a lav to deviate. Right? Meaning it's not an isser to give more or an isser to give less, it's an isser to deviate. And therefore it's one love. Right? Zohar Rakia says no. It's a isser to give more and an isser to give less. And therefore it's two lavin. Right? Okay, that's three. Okay, so what? What? Baal Tosef and Baal Tigra are two separate mitzvahs. What are you talking about? But that's very different. Baal Tosef and Baal Tigra are very different. They're about changing the nature of the mitzvah, adding an entire new mitzvah, not necessarily adding to a quantitative mitzvah. You don't always know that, meaning by tzedakah we don't have that, right? By regular tzedakah we don't say that. We don't say, aha, you're giving $5, you give $6, you're, right? We have maximums that you should be giving to avoid poverty, but like, it's not like we say, stop learning. You can learn 3 hours a day. More than that, baltos. I mean, like, it's weird. It's a chiddush, but okay. I mean, I don't think it's crazy. Okay. Then he notes the Uraim. Remember the Uraim, Rebbe Elazar of Metz in Germany. He doesn't quote it as a mitzvah at all, and we'll get to why. Okay, in 1 second. 5. The earliest running commentary we have in the Yerushalmi, though it's not on Masechta, but on any Masechta, is the Rash Cirilio, right? Reb Shimon Sterlion, I believe, who's like borderline Rishonic period, like right after the Rishonic period. He writes on some Masechta in the Yerushalmi. He's very, very good on the Masechta he has. So I was debating whether to give you this inside, but I decided against it because it's not so easy to read. So the Rash Cirilio, in his introduction to Shkolim, writes, "De'ein mekor mitzvah zu mireish parshat Tisa." He says the mitzvah to give to the Mikdash every year doesn't come from Parshat Shkolim at all. Why not? Because Parshat Shkolim is about the one-time census donation in the time of Moshe. So you could therefore say, there's no mitzvah of shkalim every year, but he doesn't. What does he do? He says, the chol parshas unyanam ba'ofen ha'minim shal b'nei Yisrael b'fkudotam ve'en gam mitzvah l'dorot el l'shalom l'mnotan lehed yalidei davar acher. He said, Parshat Kitisa was a one-time mitzvah. And the only thing you learn about that forever is that whenever you perform a census, you can't do it directly. But he says, but there is a mitzvah Machatzit HaShekel l'dorot. But the source is not Parshat Kitisa. What's the source? Which parsha? Next week's parsha. Parshat Truma. And he says, Bereish Parshat Truma, the Shalosh Truma K'tuva B'Parsha. In Parshat Truma, it talks about all the fundraising for the Mishkan in general. The Achad Mehen, Truma Machatzit HaShekel, Karbanot Tzibor. So he says, there is a mitzvah Machatzit HaShekel, but it's not the parsha of Asher Lo Yarbev, Adal Lo Yamit. That is a one-time mitzvah for the census in the time of Moshe. The source for Machatzit HaShekel afterwards is Parshat Truma. That's possibility 5. And possibility 6 is the Gra, where the Gra agrees to the Rosh Tzirillio, and he says that Parshat Kitisa is not the source for the mitzvah of Machatzit HaShekel forever. He does think, like the Rosh Tzirillio, that there is a mitzvah of Machatzit HaShekel forever, but unlike the Rosh Tzirillio, who derives it from the Psukim and Truma, the Gra just says, what's the source? Halacha Moshe Misinai. Okay? So we have 6 possibilities. The Rambam, mitzvah aseh from Parshat Truma. The Ramban seems to say mitzvah aseh and 1 mitzvah lo taseh from Parshat Truma. Zohar Rakia says, no, there are 2 lo tasehs. Don't give more and don't give less, rather than 1 lo taseh, which is don't deviate. 4, Yereim, don't count it as a mitzvah at all. We'll have to explain him. 5, Parshat Truma provides the mitzvah forever to give Machatzit HaShekel. Parshat Kitisa was the one-time mitzvah for the census, and only teaches you that forever you can't have a direct census. And mitzvah and possibly 6 is the Gra, that there's a Kitisa was a one-time mitzvah in the time of Moshe, but there is a mitzvah forever, but it's from Halacha Moshe Misinai. Now, it's possible that the Yereim would agree with the Gra, as he notes. Now, Rav Asher notes that once you have the Rosh Tzirillio, that the Torah lists the mitzvah to give Machatzit HaShekel not just in Kitisa, or what we call Parshat Shkalim, but in Truma, in the general fundraising for the Mishkan. He says that might be why you don't count the lav, right? Because if there are multiple sources for Machatzit HaShekel, and not all of them include the limitation of Ha'ashir Lo Yarbev, Adal Lo Yamit, because in Truma that doesn't appear, so then that would explain why you might not count the Lo Taseh, or for the Ramban, it might explain why when you move from Mikdash to Tzedakah, there is no maximum, even though there is a minimum. The problem is that the Rambam himself doesn't seem to hold that, because he does hold the psuk. He does quote the psukim in Kitisa, but he seems to think that Ashir Lo Yarbev, Hadal Lo Yamit, again, is a prat, is a detail in the mitzvah of giving, rather than a separate lav. Right, and the Ramah would tell you, right, and then he says conceptually the chiddush here is the minimum. Right, because many mitzvot, is the maximum. Right, many mitzvot, no. 1 second. The chiddush here would be that even if you're, the chiddush here is multiple, right? Is that here, even if you're poor, you don't give less, and even if you could give more, you don't give more, right? I mean, there are a lot of chidushim going there. Okay. That's what Rav Asher says in section Aleph. right? And therefore, again, for the Rambam, he thinks that Ashir Lo Yavev Adal Yamid is a prat, is a detail within the mitzvah of Shkalim rather than a separate mitzvah. Then, in Bet, he goes back to the Uraim, and he says, well, one possibility that he'd suggest for the Uraim who doesn't count it as a mitzvah at all is like the Gra, that it's Halacha Moshe Misinai. So it's a mitzvah, but doesn't get counted as a mitzvah because it's only Halacha Moshe Misinai. But then he gives us another suggestion, who says maybe the Uraim thinks it's not an independent mitzvah at all. Maybe the way he conceptualizes it is as a hechsher mitzvah to bringing up karbanot. Right? I mean, remember we said that it could be that Machatzit HaShekel is not about the giving, it's about the result. But you could then you can ask a sub-question, which is the mitzvah to raise money for the mikdash independently a mitzvah? Or do you say no? Since the mitzvah is only to raise money for the function in the mikdash and the bringing of the karbanot, therefore the nature of the mitzvah is only a hechsher mitzvah. Right? It's the preparatory step for the karbanot, and therefore it doesn't get to be counted as its own mitzvah at all. Now he notes that this might count down to a machloket Rashi and Tosfot as to whether when we bring the karbanot tzibor, it's only conceptually, guys, whether it's only conceptually. Right, Rashi and Tosfot argue, when you bring the karbanot, is it brought even for the people who didn't contribute, or is it brought for only for the people who contributed? Where Rashi says even the people who don't give are part of the mitzvah, of the karbanot tzibor, Tosfot says not. And that might, right, if you think that you can be part of the karbanot tzibor even if you don't actually give, that would support the notion that it's not just a hechsher mitzvah. It may be used for the karbanot, but karbanot, in the end of the day, karban tzibor is brought on behalf of the entire tzibor. Okay. A few more points. I didn't give this to you inside to read, but let me say it now outside for you. So, let's. Yeah, you know what? It is fun, Lumda, so I'll say it quickly, but I didn't want to bog you down with it. Okay, so the halacha is that women don't have to give the Machatzit HaShekel, right? That's a Mishnah in Aleph Dalet. Okay? What? It's a Mishnah. Men between 20 and 60, we know that. Yeah, we didn't count the rest of them. They don't count. Literally, don't count. They might be important, but they don't count. Yes, they do. And that's why women are not in the mitzvah, because they weren't part of the census. The Bar Tanura says that maybe the reason is not new ish kofer nafsho, that men should give ish v'lo isha. The Kiryat Sefer suggests that it's b'nei Yisrael v'lo b'not Yisrael. Meiri says maybe the reason they're pater is because it's a mitzvah that says man grama, because you do it at one specific time during the year. Now Rav Asher notes that the reason most Rishonim didn't seem to exempt them because of it was time bound is because, you know, I mean, A, Minat Torah, there doesn't seem to be a time, and B, even if there is, right, if it's result-oriented, so the time matters less. It's just about getting the money in. But women are P'tura. Okay. Another question that comes up is, what about kids who are 13 years old? In the original census, how old did you have to be counted? 20. So what about people who are 13 or chayiv in mitzvot, but they're not yet 20? Are they chayiv in Machatzit HaShekel? What do you think? So the Ramban says yes, and so does the Rambam, because in the end of the day, maybe the census one was unique and only 20-year-olds and up were chayav, but since then, everyone 13 and up is chayav. However, many Rishonim, like Rashi, Rokeach, the Chinuch, Bartanura, say no. And it's only people who are 20 and up. And the Ramah seems to go in this direction because the Ramah says that even the minhag of giving Machatzit HaShekel on Purim, before Purim, is only for people 20 and up. The Gra is a middle position, which is that anyone above 13 is chayav, but you only start confiscating property to force people to contribute from 20 and up. So between 13 and 20, you should give, but we won't coerce you if you didn't. And from 20 and up, we will coerce you to give the Machatzit HaShekel. Okay? Rasha says, why would you distinguish? So he says, it could be that after 13 you're chayav because the mitzvah applies, but we only force you once the kapara kicks in, and the kapara, which is what is highlighted in Parashat Ki Tisa, is only from 20 and up. Okay. The most interesting machloket is as follows, though. Okay? Let me ask you a question. Are women or 13-year-olds until 20 chayav in musaf? Why? Why am I even asking this question? Because shachrit, mincha, marev are chayav. Why? So first of all, they're connected to karbanot, right? Right? But also, why do we daven them? Why does the Gemara say that women are chayav in shachrit, mincha, marev, or shachrit? Whatever you think they're chayav in, shachar mincha, one deal, we talked about this last year. Rachameinenu, to ask for mercy. But what's the problem with musaf? Very good. Musaf is not for rachamim, right? It's kneged a karban directly. And therefore, the Bisamim Rosh asked the question, are women chayav in musaf? Now, what? Okay, so who's the Bisamim Rosh? So, one second. Before you get all worked up, who's the Bisamim Rosh? Andrew, who's the Bisamim Rosh? I don't expect you to know this, but it's a fun story. So, the Bisamim Rosh, in the 19th century, a sefer appeared called the Bisamim Rosh. It was published by a Rav Shaul Berlin, and it was attributed to the Rush. Right? Yeah. And he claimed to have discovered a manuscript. Elamai, when people read the Bisamim Rosh, they discovered that a lot of the tshuvot there sound very modernish, very post-emancipation, very, not Rush, which led people to wonder, maybe this is a forgery, written by Shaul Berlin rather than discovered by Shaul Berlin. Now, there has been some questions, maybe some of them are real, and he just snuck them in. Some of them, you'd look at them and you're like, that sounds very, look, like there are tshuvot in it, like, if any mitzvah causes you pain, you're patur because, we learn from Sukkah that mitzvah patur minas Sukkah, and therefore all mitzvah say you're patur. Oh, very nice, right? Now, so there are certain ideas that, like, or like when he says, you could marry, I think it's the Karaites, because even though they might be puzzle, right? They might be mamzerim. Since they die as Jews, it'd be a chil Hashem to not let them marry Jews, and chil Hashem overrides like the whole Torah. So like, there's a lot of like questionable passages in it where you're like, that sounds a little bit interesting. So the Bisamim Rosh is a very interesting book. Okay, is it 18th century? Wait, maybe it's 18th century. Not sure. Yes, Ezra. Yeah, very good. But how universal that rule is very interesting. Anyways, so But in this sort of interesting work, the Besamim Rosh, he argues that women are exempt from Musaf because women are p'turot from Machatzit HaShekel, and therefore they're patur, therefore they don't contribute to the karbanot, and there's no rachamim, like Shachris Mincha Maariv, right? And therefore women are patur. Now, many of the other Achronim pushed back very heavily on him for several reasons. One was, the best conceptual reason is that, well, there's a few. One is to say that just because they don't contribute doesn't mean it isn't brought on their behalf, right? Those are two separate questions, right? One question is who has to fund the karbanot. The second is for whom are the karbanot brought. You could very much say that the karbanot are brought on behalf of everyone, including the people who don't give it, and therefore they're shayach to musaf, even if they're not shayach on the karban. The second thing is to say, just because tfilat musaf is keneged the karban musaf doesn't mean it's identical to the karban musaf, just like shachar min chamarev are keneged the karbanot, but they're not actually the karbanot, right? They are tfilot of rachamim, right, for supplication that happen to be modeled on the karbanot. Right, both of those would lead to saying that women are chayav. And many of the Achronim pushed back in this way. First of all, they noted that according to this logic, Kohanim should also not be chayav because according in the Mishnah tells you that according to Rabbi Yehuda, Kohanim were pater from Machatzit HaShekel. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, would Kohanim be pater from davening musaf? Or according to the Shita who hold that 13-year-olds aren't chayav, you're not chayav until you're 20, so all of you, Gavi, are you 20 yet? All of you except for Gavi should be pater for musaf. Look at that head there, right? And no one ever says that. That's not true. That actually I found when I looked through the sugya that there is one achron that in fact says this. I found it quoted. It might even be a prima gadim, I think, but I found it quoted in the Leviat Chain of Rav Ovadia, which is his parish on Masechet Shabbat. Now, Rav Asher notes that the Maram Shik said, wait a second. According to the Besamim Rosh's logic, so then women should be pater from all tefillot. Shachar Mincha and Maariv, if you take it to its logical extreme. But Rav Asher said, no, obviously that's wrong, because maybe you would argue that Musaf is a more direct replacement of the karban musaf than Shachar Mincha Maariv are of the karbanot. Because, as I said, Shachar Mincha Maariv are tefillot of rachamim that are parallel to the karbanot rather than a tefillah which is replacing the karban. So maybe the chiddush is local to musaf, but even there it really is very, very weird. And again, the reason you'd push back on it is, in the end of the day, it's tefillah and women are chayav in tefillah, and the karbanot are brought on behalf of them even if they don't have to give it. And that's what Rav Asher says in number 2, right? Rav Asher pushes back in 2 ways. One is, in the end of the day, it's tefillah, not karban. And 2 is, right? Even though they may not have to give it, they still get kapara from it. So they're conceptually linked to Musaf, and therefore he thinks it's just wrong. And even according to Tosfot, he thinks that even though we saw before that Tosfot said that anyone who doesn't contribute, the karbanon aren't mechaber for him, he thinks that's only if you're supposed to give Machatzit HaShekel and you choose not to. Because then, it's like a punishment. But the people who are not chayav to begin with, he takes it as a given that the karbanon are brought on their behalf as well. Okay, so that was just some other lamdos that's just from Machatzit HaShekel. But like I said, tomorrow is tomorrow. This Shabbos is Parashat Shkolim, so I figured it was worth at least exploring a little bit of the lamdos of Machatzit HaShekel. And of course, right, we have the minhag. It's only a minhag, but we have the minhag to give a Machatzit HaShekel leading up to Purim. I will note that there are some that, based on some of these limitations, limited. So if you look at the Torah Tamima, which is the last source I gave you yesterday, he in fact holds, like the Basam Rosh, and he holds that women and children don't have to give. No, I'm sorry, the opposite. The Torah Tamima says that even though this is parallel to Machatzit HaShekel, in the end it's a minhag of tzedakah, which is like loosely motivated. So even if you hold that women are pater from Machatzit HaShekel and kids are pater from Machatzit HaShekel, he thinks the minhag of Machatzit HaShekel women would give. Because at the end of the day, it's just a mitzvah tzedakah, right? It's loosely based on Machatzit HaShekel, but like, it's more about the Nes of Purim and things like that. And therefore he takes it as a given that they would be chayav. Okay, but that's some details that distinguish the minhag. That cat is huge. From the Machatzit HaShekel D'Oraisa. Okay? So that ends our discussion of Machatzit HaShekel in time for Parshat Shkalim.